Mélanie Joly joining me in studio. May I say the first person to do so in a couple of years, but it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Minister. Thank you for making time for us this morning. If we could start right there, the talks between Russia and Ukraine, you just heard they are ongoing, and Ukrainian officials are saying they are very difficult. As Minister, through your channels and networks, do you have any concrete details about how they are going?
They are difficult. I've talked to my colleague Dmytro Kuleba, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Ukraine. And I talk to Dmytro pretty much every day or every 2 days. What we need to do to reinforce Ukraine's position at the table of negotiation is definitely to send more weapons in order for people to defend themselves on the ground, but also more sanctions. And that's why also we announced 22 new sanctions yesterday on Belarusian entities and people. And so that has been his call to us, but also to the G7. And that's what we're doing along with other colleagues from the European Union and the United States.
So we'll talk about further military assistance and sanctions in a moment. Just back to the talks, though. The U.S. yesterday said it's not seeing any meaningful efforts on Russia's part to bring an end to this war through diplomacy. Do you trust that Russia is negotiating in good faith?
No, I'm not. Because what is happening right now is Ukrainians are trying to negotiate humanitarian corridors to protect civilians. Meanwhile, Russia is bombarding, is shelling civilians, which is a war crime. We know that Ukraine has been wanting the Red Cross to be in Ukraine. Russia is against it because they don't want the Red Cross to look into what is being done by the Russian forces. And so there are war crimes being committed. There are crimes against humanity being committed. Canada has petitioned also the International Criminal Court on this. We've also worked with Ukraine before the International Court of Justice to support their petition against Russia.
Which just ruled this week and urged Russia, ordered Russia to stop.
Exactly.
And again, the probe into those war crimes, crimes against humanity is continuing very aggressively from what we hear from that office. So in Ukraine, in asking for the humanitarian corridors, to enforce that, one of the things that we've heard, of course, from Ukraine is the demand for a no-fly zone. Next week, NATO leaders will meet in Brussels. Prime Minister Trudeau will be attending. And I'm wondering, do you expect that NATO will again reject President Zelensky's request for that no-fly zone?
Well, obviously, I've heard the call from President Zelensky. I was in the House of Commons with the Prime Minister and my colleagues. What we need to do in this instance is two things. First and foremost, we know that there's a red line, and that red line is not to trigger any international conflict. And that's why we cannot accept a no-fly zone. Not only us, but NATO and all of its members. Our position is all the same. But the other thing we need to do, Heather, is to help Ukrainians deal with their airspace.
Yes.
So that's why weapons and anti-missiles weapons are really important, and that's why we're providing many of these weapons, but also other countries as well.
So the red line, you've been clear in that, but I just had a guest, an expert on cyber attacks, cyber warfare, anticipating three scenarios: cyber attacks, chemical, nuclear, as all being possibilities for Russia. Does the red line shift, though, on no-fly, if any of those three are involved?
Well, I won't talk about different scenarios here on the show, but definitely we're having conversations within the G7 because we know that this could escalate. And so we know that this is Putin's war. There's a level of irrationality with his decision-making, with his way of thinking. And so that's why we have to be ready for many scenarios.
It underscores the urgency, this extraordinary leaders meeting next week in Brussels. Short of a no-fly zone, NATO leaders are going to be asked to approve other measures. And Defense Minister Anand was on Power and Politics this week. And what she was saying was Canada's tapped out when it comes to additional measures, that there is no more inventory of weapons for Canada to contribute. So what then do you expect NATO's ask of Canada to be?
Well, we'll work with NATO and we'll work with Minister Anand together and I together to make sure that we have the right tools to support Ukraine and also we can work with the private sector. And as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I work with Minister Anand also on approving export permits for lethal aid, and that's exactly what I'll be doing.
Do you expect there will be any pledge from Canada on defense spending?
Well, I think that we need to be able to adapt to these challenging times. Definitely, we've seen what Germany has done by pledging 2% of its defense budget. I think that our military needs to be better equipped and quickly. And I think that in that context, Canada must be able to protect its Great North, the Arctic, and also make sure that we're ready for any scenarios that could be upcoming.
Because again, coming back to Minister Anand again on power and politics, she said that she's considering aggressive options prior to the budget coming out in April. One of the options she's putting on the table for the finance ministers is to actually increase Canada's defense spending to above 2% of GDP. Would you support that?
I'm in support of increasing definitely our
to
budget.
Above GDP?
At
There's
this
some talk
point,
of 2.5%, even 3% now within NATO.
Heather, I need to see what that includes. But I think we have to do two things. Definitely, we need to better equip our forces, like I mentioned. I've been to Ukraine and have seen Operation Unifier just before the war, what we were doing to train Ukrainian soldiers. Great work by the armed forces. I've been to Latvia, where we're leading also a NATO mission there. And I was in Romania last week and seeing what is being done by our air forces. That being said, I think also that we need to support our diplomacy as well, because we know that in the past there's been cuts, and we need to make sure that we have strong embassies, particularly in this part of the world.
So the Prime Minister himself acknowledged at the beginning of March that the defense context is changing, and you indicated that. So NATO buffing or bolstering its defense and deterrence presence in Eastern Europe, it sounds like you're open to that kind of an increase. And I think there would be those who would be welcoming that kind of an openness. You delivered an interview on CTV earlier this week that has had a lot of attention. And in case anybody didn't hear the exact quote that has caused a lot of consternation, is you're saying we're a middle-sized power, and what we're good at is convening and making sure that diplomacy is happening and convincing other countries to do more. That didn't sit well with a number of former Canadian generals who thought you sold them short, thought you sold Canadian military contributions short. Do you regret that statement now?
Well, like I mentioned, I support their work. I've seen it. I've been on site. I've had these conversations with Frédéric Côté, for example, in Ukraine, who was leading the mission there. Many of the important generals at NATO as well. And not only do I support it, but I think we have to do more.
Are we reduced at this point to being nothing more than conveners?
I think that on the diplomatic side, we're strong conveners. And at the same time, yes, we are a military force. We have to do both, and it's not neither either or. We have to do both, and at the same time, we know we have to do more on NORAD modernization with the Americans. We need to play our part within NATO, and that's what we'll do. That's also why we've announced a month ago, just before the beginning of the war, a reinforcement of our eastern flank. And our government has committed a lot on the defense budget, but I personally think we need to do more.
As we speak, Minister, there is a phone call going on. You heard my mentioning at the beginning of the hour, U.S. President Joe Biden on the phone with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and they're trying to get some clarity on what China's position is on Russia's invasion. Russia has asked China, the U.S. says, for military and economic assistance. And China seems to be trying to position itself as a neutral third party. What is Canada's position on that?
Well, our position is that China is sitting on the UN Security Council. And in that sense, the country can't do anything to escalate the conflict. I've asked my officials to convey that position. And I think also we need to engage with China. And we will engage with China.
How?
By convening, obviously, by conveying that information, but also by having direct talks with them. And that's what G7 countries are doing as well. You're seeing it with President Biden today, but that will be the case with other leaders of the world.
President Biden warned of consequences, and other U.S. officials have used the word costs if China helps Russia. Would Canada go as far as supporting economic sanctions?
What we've done since the beginning is we've worked with the G7. We've made sure that the West was united. We'll continue to put maximum pressure on the Russian regime, but at the same time, we want to make sure that there's no loopholes.
But directly in terms of China, I mean, that would turn that into, again, a global dispute. It would roil the markets. Would you be in support? There is some discussion of this, whether that should be a consequence.
At this point, I think diplomacy is very important. That's why we need to engage. We need to have the conversations. There are lots of links between our economy and the Chinese economy. And at the same time, I'm working on an Indo-Pacific strategy, and we'll have more to say in the coming days about it.
Today is the 8th anniversary of Vladimir Putin's annexation of Crimea. 8 years ago today, they signed those documents. Obviously, you weren't in the portfolio then, or indeed in federal politics at that time, but the consensus now is the world did not do enough to stop Vladimir Putin at that time. Did not act strongly enough, did not do enough. I'm wondering, why will it be any different this time?
Because what we have done as the West is that we've decided to isolate diplomatically, economically, and politically speaking Putin and his regime. We've closed our airspace. We've banned Russian ships from ports. We've decided to do an oil ban. We've decided also to sanction more than 1,000 people, Russian and Belarusian entities and people. We're putting maximum pressure. We're doing it with the EU, with the UK, with the United States. We haven't seen that since the Second World War. So our diplomacy is really, I think, stepping up in a way that we can be proud, because the country's leading the diplomatic efforts. But at the same time, my job and Prime Minister's job and many of our counterparts' job is to talk to all the other countries that are not part of the G7, that voted against Russia at the United Nations, these 141 countries. And we need to make sure that also they're on board in putting also maximum pressure against Russia.
We shall see. Day 23, and no sign that there is any end to this war in sight. Minister Joly, thank you very much
for
being here for us this morning.